we'd like to introduce Tom, who's been a longstanding member of Ocean11 since its inception. He's been a leader of community outreach, and most recently, he spent several months working in and around Australia. So, without further ado, we'd like to introduce again, because he's already spoken twice, Tom.
Hey everybody, my name is Tom. John, can I share my screen by any chance? I cannot share screen. Oh, yes. There we go. So you guys can see my screen now. Cool. So yeah, like John said, I was super lucky to be able to study abroad last term. Well, fall term actually, in Australia, through a program called SITs, the School for International Training. And the title of the program was Rainforest, Reef, and Cultural Ecology. So we focused on, those three things as we went throughout. This is the beautiful group of people that I was able to study abroad with, from all over the United States. And here's a meme I made. So I want to include as much as I learned as possible, just so it's not me, blabbing on about what I was able to do. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to just plop them in the chat and I'll answer them as I go. So, oh, there we go. A little bit of background about what Australia even is in terms of geography. So it was connected to Antarctica until 55 million years ago. So it's been moving slowly up towards the equator. And that's part of the reason why it's so unique biologically. You get a ton of animals that only live there because it's been isolated for so long. And it's also the flattest continent that exists because there's no real glaciation events that pass through there. And yeah, it's super unique because it has very arid and low nutrient conditions around most of the continent here. So you get a lot of interesting adaptations that happen to these animals. So the program that I was on is kind of a non-conventional study abroad. So it was just the 19 of us, like we saw, and it was broken into modules. So there was the orientation section, a homestay section where we lived with a family in Cairns, which is up here, which is where the program was based. And then we had a camping trip that was focused more on the arid environments out here. So it was kind of western in Australia. And then there was a rainforest section where we learned all about the wet tropics region and the tropical rainforest that surrounds this area, which was interesting because you don't really, think about Australia as a place that has a tropical rainforest. You think of it more as, that arid environment. And then finally, what I'll spend the bulk of the presentation on is Lizard Island, which was right here. It's a little island in the far north Great Barrier Reef where they do a ton of research about bleaching, about animals that live on the reef. And then after the trip there, we went down on a road trip on our own time down to Sydney. I might talk a little bit about that just because there's a lot of interesting animals that we were able to see. So now that that's out of the way, it started with a homestay situation. Just, suburban Cairns. This is the family I stayed with. That's Robin here, Josh and Sophie. And it was just interesting to learn about, the average Australian thought process and lifestyle. Because it's a fairly conservative area ideologically up in North Australia. So it was interesting to get different perspectives. And it was a lot of focus on the local birds during that section. So in Australia, really common birds are this guy, which is called the common myna, and they've got that really cool kind of yellow thing going on with their eye. A curlew, and these guys have these massive eyes, and they like look super scared all the time, and they're always looking around and screeching. But the coolest kind of local bird that you see all the time there is this bird called a rainbow lorikeet, and they literally look like that. They're insane. They're like just super colorful, squawking super loud all the time. And it makes you feel like you're like in some sort of like, foreign area, like with crazy alien birds, but they're just around there. So that's kind of cool. And And then after that was a 10-day camping trip. So this is our campsite. This is my buddy Nate, looking real great. And there's kind of horses wandering around our campsite, which was pretty cool. And this section of the trip focused a lot more on that, typical kind of arid Australian outback that you imagine. But it also focused a lot on Aboriginal culture and history. So this man here, this is Russell Butler. He was the teacher for that section of the trip. And it was super, I feel super grateful to have had this as part of the education because, it's a super unique lifestyle and like thought processes. And it was great to hear from Russell Butler, who like lived through so much of the Aboriginal civil rights timeline, as you see on the right here. And it's interesting how fresh and like recent a lot of these developments have been, because Aboriginal people didn't even have the right to vote until 1967, which if you think about it is like not even one human lifetime ago. So it's super, super fresh. And it was just, really great to be able to hear it from his perspective. There's a lot of interesting things to their civil rights movement, like the stolen generations and the stolen wages, as part of like government suppression of Aboriginal rights. And I just feel super grateful to have been able to hear from his perspective. If you want to learn more about that, we can talk about it after if you have some questions, or you can research on your own. But definitely worth knowing, then of course you get lots of kangaroos out there in the outback. They're much more adapted to kind of flat, big areas like the center of Australia. And then there's a lot of like lava tubes through there. So we're able to go exploring those a little bit. And then after that was the rainforest trip. So it's important kind of to get perspective on why the rainforest is there. So like I mentioned, as Australia is moving north in latitude, it becomes more and more dry as it approaches the equator. And so all of the rainforests have been pushed up into the higher elevation. So on the left here, we've got an elevation map. So you can see up here, there's the mountains, down here, there's the mountains. And then on the right here is kind of the biomes overlaid with that. So you can see in the high elevation areas is where there's the rainforest now. There used to be much more rainforest in Australia before it got so arid. And so the area in the northeast here is called the Wet Tropics region, and it's a World Heritage Site because it's one of the oldest rainforests in the world. And it also has a super high level of endemism, which is basically when an animal only lives in one area, because it is such a unique area in Australia. And so 50% of the birds, 36% of mammals, and 60% of butterflies that are found in Australia are all found in that tiny little area up in the northeast. So it's super interesting to be in that area and see all those animals. And it was super cool because we would be able to just hike through the area, and it was basically our classroom because our teacher would stop and at a water break, point out a plant, give us the lesson about the plant. And it was super, super, super fun. So one of the assignments was to become an expert on a plant. My plant was the Australian stinging tree. Everyone is always talking about the scary bugs in Australia, but this plant is like one of the scariest things that we came across. You can read that quote if you want to be terrified, but basically they have little stingers that come out of their leaves, just covering them. And they're so small and fine and transparent that you can't even see them, and they'll stick in your hand, and you just have to like wash them all out eventually, but they're so hard to find. And it's just like, oh man, I was never leaving the trail. There's no way you could find me near one of those bushes. And then the coolest part about the rainforest is probably the platypus project, where we'd go to a creek at like 5 in the morning and just count how many platypuses we saw, and then use everyone's data to try to get an idea of how many platypuses were actually in that area. There's a little video of them swimming. They're so cute. They're like a foot long. They're a lot smaller than you'd imagine, but it's from our data compared to the data before, the year before, it seems like their populations are increasing. It's hard to know because it's very circumstantial. It might have just been, happenstance that they were feeding more on that day, but either way, platypuses are fun. And so here, the next section was Lizard Island. So this is the part that's most interesting for us as ocean people. So this is what Lizard Island looks like from above. And then it's right about here, kind of like far, far north. You can maybe see those little tiny islands in there. But yeah, and you can see that it's surrounded almost completely by reef, and then the shallow water around here all contains reef as well. And so it's a really great area for reef studies because you can access it super easily by boat. So this is the plane that we had to take to get to Lizard Island. Because there's no commercial airports or anything like that, you can even see the runway right there. It's super, super small. And so on the flight over, you can see all the fringing reefs and reefs popping out of the water. Here's Lizard as you kind of come up to it on the plane. And that's a panorama of kind of what the beaches look like there. It's super, super white sand because of all the coral that washes up there. And along the shore, you can find all sorts of crazy things that come off the reef. All over the place, there's these cuttlefish bones that you can just pick up, look at, like they're just like normal shells there, but it's insane. And it's called Lizard Island because of these guys. They're called goannas. They're like 2-foot long lizards. They're pretty harmless, but they are kind of spooky looking and they run really weird. And yeah, it was originally named Lizard Island by Captain Cook, who landed there, and the only animals that he found on land were these giant lizards. So therefore it became Lizard Island. And so I'll get into the research that I was part of here. So the entire group was there for 10 days. And then the last section of the study abroad experience was a independent study project. So for 5 weeks, everyone finds their own advisor somewhere in Australia, goes to wherever they are, and basically does research with them as like an apprentice, helper, researcher. And I was super fortunate to be able to stay on Lizard Island with a research team from JCU. There's a picture of us at Thanksgiving. So this is my research team over here. And I was fortunate to be able to be part of 2 projects, so I'll get into that right now. So basically what we were looking at is how fish respond to the changing reef. So as I'm sure most of you know, there's a huge issue with coral bleaching going on in the Great Barrier Reef. A lot of it's caused by sea surface temperature changes as the corals no longer have their symbiotic algae that's providing so much of the food for them, they turn white. And then if they continue to not have their algae for several weeks, they might end up dying. So it's important to know how the animals that depend on the reef are going to respond to that, because it's tough to say if temperatures will ever be able to go back to how they were before. And so we're trying to predict how the fish are going to respond. So basically, what the research team had done before is taken fish and assess them based on a bunch of factors. So these factors listed here, to see what determines how well they survive. They would take them out of the reef as little tiny fish, do a bunch of tests, put them back, and then see if they survived, and then related which of these factors predicted whether they're going to survive best. And so that was done on a live reef, and our research was done on a dead reef, basically. So we would take fish out, raise them in a live or dead coral environment, take all these measurements on them, and then return them onto reefs, and then determine what were the factors that were causing them to survive in a live versus a dead reef. It's a little bit complicated, I know, but it's an important thing to know about the fish as the reef changes. So how we would do it is we would collect fish in these light traps. We'd go out at like 5 p.m. and then set them all out. And then at 6 in the morning the next day, we'd go, you can see this little boat out there coming back from bringing them back. And the light would attract little fish and they'd get stuck in there, and then we'd be able to sort them by species, return the ones that we're not going to use, and keep the ones that we were interested in. Kind of fun thing about this is it did not just attract the fish that we were looking for. It attracted all sorts of crazy sea creatures that you find on the reef. So we'd have a little fun tank is what we called it, all the little fish that weren't being used in research, but obviously people would want to see. It was kind of in this central area in the research station. So we'd have all sorts of crazy things coming in and out of there. We had this little clownfish, but it was like black with a like neon blue kind of headband instead of a white or a black one like you normally see. There's a little pufferfish, kind of hard to tell, but that blob is a pufferfish. We had groupers, nudibranchs, there's a little brittle star coming out of here, and a cuttlefish. And we had an octopus. They're like this big. They're like half an inch across, little baby guys. But yeah, that's kind of fun. But this is the fish that we were interested in. It's a damselfish called the Palmacentris ambonesis. Ambons for short is what they're called. And they're good because you get a lot of them in the light traps. They reproduce quickly, and they're a common reef fish that is well known. So basically, like I said, we'd raise them in the 2 treatments. We've got the live coral, dead coral. We'd have multiple treatments so we could run multiple trials as they acclimate. And so some preliminary results, and then after we'd run the trials, we would bring them back out onto the patch reefs. This is the fun part where we got to get in the water. So this here is a little patch reef. It's basically just a section of coral where we would put the fish, make sure they stay there, and then we'd be able to go back each day to see if they were still there. And then it's presumptive that if they weren't on the reef, they had been eaten and not swam away, because they're super territorial. They don't really go to different areas. They kind of stick to one spot on the reef. And also, that's a big distance for such a little fish. So if they were to try to cross the great expanse there, they probably, unfortunately, might not make it. And then we'd go around. Here's Eric from the research team, and he would just check off whether they're alive still. And then, so here's some of the results. It seemed like, unfortunately, the fish survived much worse on the degraded reef than on the living reef. There's a lot of possible explanations, and also there's a lot of factors that might have influenced this, and this isn't even all the data we had collected. So this is just some very preliminary results here. But it was 237 fish, so it's still definitely, worth something here. And side note, I spent so long making this graph. It was like so much work. It's so simple, it looks like, but you have no idea the pain that went into making this graph. Anyway, and then in terms of those factors that I was talking about earlier, what it seemed like, I won't go into what each factor is because that would take forever, and they're a little bit convoluted in a way. But basically, on the live reef, what seemed to allow them to survive the most were things that had to do with getting more food and competing for resources. Whereas on the dead reef, it seemed like it was a lot more things related to not getting eaten. So what may be causing that difference in factors that allow the fish to survive is that, here's a very oversimplification of what's going on, but on the live reef, there's more fish, you get a lot more competition, so you're less likely to be eaten if a predator comes along. And also, as a bright yellow fish, you stand out a lot less on a bright yellow background than, a more degraded algae-dominated situation. So, of course, this is not, don't take that as scientific fact, that's just what we made sense of from the data that we saw. And so, preliminary kind of conclusion there is that it's kind of spooky for the future of these fish, at least. So it definitely points to the need for more research to be done on what is causing these fish to survive. And also, it would be interesting to hear more about fish that have lower reproduction rates, since the ambons are super, super fecund and have a ton of babies. So it would be interesting to see if different factors affect an animal that only reproduces every few years or something like that. And so that was one of the research projects going on. The other one was based more on, oh, before I get to that, some fun pictures of fun sea creatures. This is a coral. You can see here it's got its polyps sticking out, which is cool. You get a ton of sharks around there, which is fun. That's a little white tip reef shark. It's kind of funny because you always think, like, you know, in movies and beach movies and stuff, everyone's like shark and everyone screams and gets out of the water. But you know, when you're there and you see a shark, everyone's like shark, and everyone's swimming as fast as they can to see the shark. So it's kind of cool. You kind of get a twisted view of sharks from the media. Tons of little clownfish and damselfish in their little houses. They're a lot less friendly than you might think they are. They're super territorial. So if another fish is coming towards them, they'll dart out at them. And then if you're a snorkeler going up to them, they might dart out and try to like get you to get away. And it's like, dude, you're like 4 inches across. I don't know what your plan is here. But yeah, they're kind of funny little guys. And then there's also this. It looks ugly, but it's actually really cool. It's an ostracod, which is a crustacean, and it's actually bioluminescent. So if you go in the water at night, you can kind of see them lighting up here and there, bright blue. And then if the tide comes in and then goes out, and you kick sand at night, you can see a bunch of little blue dots kind of in the sand. But yeah, there's just a huge diversity of life that the reef supports. So it's super important that we're continuing to conserve. And then the other research project that I was involved in, fortunately, was with snails. So on the left here, these are strom snails, or they're related to like conch shells. And then on the right here are cone snails, and these are super poisonous. Like if a cone snail, this type at least, the Rembrandt cone snail, is big enough and it can sting you and actually has enough venom to kill a human being. Usually it's just a crazy pain, but they're crazy animals. And the guys on the left, the conch shells, they have the ability to jump. So they're not slow like you'd imagine a snail. They kind of have a leg that they're able to kick and jump away. And so what we were trying to look at is, does plastic leachates in the water, so the plastic being in the water and releasing chemicals in the water, does that have an effect on the predator-prey interaction of these snails? Because the cone snails will feed on these strom snails if they are able to catch them. So we'd go around. This is a horrible quality picture of Lizard Island from above, and snorkel around in these areas in like ankle deep water, looking real dumb, picking up a bunch of snails to run trials on. And so we'd bring them back. That's what they look like. That the strom snails have little eyes that like poke out. Super weird. They kind of look like Gary from SpongeBob, but they're yeah, you don't think of snails having eyes, but they do. And then so we put them into the different areas with different types of plastics to see how the snails would interact with their predator and prey, determined on what type of plastic they were with. Unfortunately, this data is still all being analyzed, but it is an interesting concept. It seemed like they were able to respond faster in the control without any plastic, but once the predator was in there, then they're all running away. So it might be something like the plastic is just generally makes them feel less healthy and less likely to be moving around normally than than they would if there was no plastic in the water. Yeah, so after that's the main research part. But in terms of the reef, I kind of wanted to leave you guys with this. It's not all doom and gloom in terms of coral bleaching and cyclones. This is from another research team that was on Lizard Island while I was there. And they come every year and take 3D scans of the reef in a bunch of different sections. and super, super cool research because they have a huge engineering team and just crazy smart people doing this. And this is from one section of the reef. This is in 2014 after a major cyclone. And I believe there was a bleaching event before this as well. And so you can see the reef is not looking fantastic. A lot of dead coral, a lot of bleached coral. And in 2014, but then in 2015, you can see a bunch of these little foliaceous corals are starting to come back. There's a lot of little spawn corals. Then in 2017, you get a ton of growth. And then this is in 2019. So although there's a lot of damage being done to these corals and a lot of negative things happening to them, they have the ability to respond if their environment is right. So there's a lot of hope left, especially in places like Lizard Island, where people are super passionate about restoration, and places like Ocean11 meetings where people really care about these things. It's not like it's too late, and it's not like it's irreversible, as long as people care enough to do something about it. So that's that about the reef. This is the research group that's from all over the place. There's people from Hawaii, from St. Andrews, from Sydney. If you have more questions, feel free to contact me. I can connect you to those people. And yeah, thanks for listening. If anybody has any questions, feel free from any part of the presentation there. I know there's a lot of stuff in there.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So did you get or did you have to have a scuba license before you went?
No, you do not. So we actually did not do any scuba diving as part of any of the research, just because I think there's a lot of insurance issues and liability issues with having some random kid come and scuba dive with you, but yeah, and everything is less than 20 feet, so you can free dive and snorkel pretty much to anything you'd want to see. But yeah, good question.
I was kind of wondering if you knew what conditions those other corals were under and like why they are coming back.
Yeah, great question. So I'm pretty sure that this area is kind of sheltered from the ocean side of the island. So it's kind of in a cove where when the hurricanes would come through, or the cyclones in the southern hemisphere or whatever, when the cyclones would come through, they wouldn't be in the full force of that cyclone. So they were able to have more stable conditions, whereas an area that was on the ocean side would be getting battered by waves and cyclones more frequently. Cool.
One more. Oh, go ahead. Who else?
Oh no, I was, but you can go first.
No, go ahead, Drew.
I was gonna ask, as far as like the entirety of the trip goes, so not necessarily just the research portion, but like the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think was the most helpful thing, or what was your biggest, like, what was your favorite part, I guess? It's not exactly what I'm asking, but what is something that like you learned while you were abroad that you can take back and like apply here at Oregon State?
That's a great question.
Because like I'm sure you met like a bunch of new people and you have like all these like cool connections.
Definitely. I guess one of the most interesting things, I guess, is, especially on Lizard, is the similarity in hope of people who want the environment to be better, I guess. So on Lizard Island, with people who have dedicated themselves to doing environmental research and conservation, there's a lot of, you know, I keep saying it, but there's a lot of hope where it's like, this is possible to fix this, you know, and being surrounded by people who want to fix it gives you that mentality and drive, and it just snowballs. So I think that would probably be the best thing from that.
Totally.
So you maybe answered this already and I just missed it. So why did you pick those two particular snails?
Yeah, so first of all, they have a predator-prey interact, or they are predator and prey, so we knew that they would have that interaction. And the good thing about the Strom snails is they have that jumping ability, so it's really easy to see if they're running away from something, basically. And you don't have to leave them in all day. So it's just easier to quantify, you know, them running away and convert it, you know, to graphable data, basically. And they're also really pretty.
I might have missed it, but what program did you go through?
It was through a program called SIT, so School of International Training is the title. They do stuff all over the world with similar, you know, structure. But yeah.
If someone else was going to do this kind of experience, what would be something that you would tell them to as a preparation for it?
I would say just kind of like let go and let the program kind of take you where it's going to take you, because it's like, especially in the beginning, like I kind of flew over the beginning parts, like the homestay and camping trip, but there's a lot of like, well, what's tomorrow going to be like? And then Tony, who's the academic advisor, is like, don't worry about it, we'll get to that tomorrow. So it's a lot of just like, you know, don't expect it to be anything and just take it as it comes, basically.
Well, if there are any other questions, you can always email Tom or email us. In contact with Tom if you're interested in doing this internship. Of course, follow up with him because it sounds like an amazing opportunity. But if Tom doesn't have any other thing to share, I'm going to ask him to stop sharing his screen.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you.
Wait. How do I do this?
So it's towards the top if you, like it's in red.
Ah, yes.
There you go.
There we go.
So this is just going to be our little send-off as always. If you're not already part of Ocean11, please tell your friends, join our band. We have shirts, we have straws, we have people that are going places that have been places. We just want to connect with people and help out the ocean. Thank you for coming.
Great job, Tom. Really good.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Good to see your face.
Good job, Tom.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
Thank you.
Oh, Tom, why don't you introduce yourself?
Oh, hi, you guys. Tom Calvanese. I'm your station manager here in Port Orford, and that's what you see behind me. Those are the fishing boats here. And I was particularly interested in tuning in, because I'm interested in your club, and I want to invite you once we get to do this again to make a field trip down here to Port Orford and check it out. It's an awesome place. And also looking forward to working with Tom, who will be our Marine Reserve Interpretation intern. And I'll be in touch with you, Tom. I wanted to give you some space to get ready for this, but I'm looking forward to chatting with you about what's to come this summer. And hopefully it's going to involve you coming down here and having a totally different, but also very interesting experience.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. Thanks.
Great job, you guys. I love the club, and I'm keeping track of what you're up to, so keep up the good work.